Good morning, Alex and friends. I'm Grace. Today is Monday, May 11th, 2026, and you're listening to Alex's News. The weather in Riverside will reach a high of 72.3 degrees today, with a low of 56.5 degrees. So, it is a good day to check the forecast before you head out the door. Later in the show, we will break down the complex and puzzling circumstances behind how a massive $200 billion war funding bill became inextricably linked to a prison facility located deep in a Florida swamp. We will also cover several other significant stories from across the globe that you need to know about as we begin our week together. There is a lot to get to in this episode, so stay tuned for all that and more right here on Alex's News. Welcome back. It's Monday, May 11th, 2026, and Washington is in the middle of an extraordinary session that ties a massive war supplemental to a controversial detention site in the Everglades, and even to a brand new Florida law. To walk us through all of it, we're joined by our reporter, Chloe. Chloe, good morning.
Good morning, Grace. There's a lot moving at once, so let's start with the centerpiece. Congress has been finalizing what's being called a grand bargain, built around a $200 billion war supplemental called the Persian Gulf Stability and Defense Act. According to reports from ABC News and NPR, this is one of the largest emergency funding requests in modern history. The Senate passed it just 4 days ago, on May 7th.
$200 billion is a staggering number. What exactly is that money paying for?
It's broken into 4 big buckets. $120 billion goes to direct military operations and maintenance for the Air Force and Navy. $45 billion is security assistance for regional allies, including Saudi Arabia and the UAE. Then there's $20 billion in domestic oil subsidies to soften the blow at the pump, and $15 billion for cyber defense to harden the U.S. power grid against retaliatory Iranian state-sponsored hacks.
And all of this stems from Operation Epic Fury, right? Remind our listeners what triggered the request.
That's right. The administration argued the funds were critical after what's being called the Strait of Hormuz incident. Carrier strike groups took damage and need immediate repairs, and the military has burned through a huge stockpile of precision-guided munitions. The U.S. Navy is also maintaining an ongoing blockade in the Strait of Hormuz, which is not cheap to sustain.
Was the vote close? I imagine a price tag like that draws opposition from all directions.
It nearly came apart. The New York Times described what it called, quote, an unlikely horseshoe coalition, end quote, of isolationist conservatives and anti-war progressives. They argued the bill was, quote, a down payment on another forever war, end quote. The package did pass shortly before the May recess, but only after some significant concessions, and that's where the story gets more complicated.
Let's get into those concessions. I understand a Florida detention facility became a major flashpoint.
Yes. It's the South Florida Detention Facility, but most people know it by its nickname, Alligator Alcatraz. It sits 40 miles deep in the Everglades at the Dade Collier Training and Transition Airport, which was actually a failed Cold War-era supersonic jetport. The Miami Herald and Politico describe it as a massive, soft-sided tent complex on a 10,500-foot runway, surrounded by predator-infested waters and thick sawgrass.
And there was an effort to shut it down as part of this grand bargain?
There was. A so-called closure amendment would have reprogrammed $5 billion from the war budget to decommission the site, but to satisfy fiscal hawks and the Trump administration, that provision was stripped from the final deal. So the facility stays open, at least for now.
Governor Ron DeSantis has been defending the site for months. What's his case?
He's called it a success. He claims 22,000 undocumented individuals have been staged and, quote, repatriated, end quote, through the site since July of 2025. But an investigation by the Tampa Bay Times suggests those numbers may be misleading. FAA flight manifests and DHS records show that while the facility can handle that volume, averaging 70 to 75 arrivals and departures a day. Roughly 40% of those repatriated were actually transferred to other federal hubs in Texas and Louisiana, not deported.
So the throughput is real, but the destination isn't always abroad. What's the day-to-day cost of running it?
It runs about $1.2 million a day, and the state of Florida is still seeking $608 million in federal reimbursement. Beyond the budget questions, there are serious legal and environmental fights. The Miccosukee tribe and environmental groups are challenging the facility in court, citing sewage runoff and the fact that the site is sinking at a rate of about 2 inches per year.
2 inches a year. That alone sounds like a long-term problem. Let's pivot to another major thread in all of this, the case of Nicolas Maduro.
Right. The former Venezuelan president was captured on January 3rd of this year, just over 4 months ago, during Operation Absolute Resolve. According to CNN and the Associated Press, that was a decapitation strike carried out by U.S. Delta Force and the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment. He was extracted to the USS Iwo Jima and then flown to New York City along with his wife, Cilia Flores.
And where does his case stand today?
As of this morning, Maduro is being held at the Metropolitan Detention Center in Brooklyn. His federal trial in the Southern District of New York is still in the pre-trial phase. U.S. District Judge Alvin Hellerstein recently postponed the next hearing until June 30th, about 7 weeks from now. The court is wrestling with whether Maduro can use Venezuelan government funds to pay for his legal defense.
That's a fascinating legal question on its own. Now, the third piece of this puzzle is happening at the state level in Florida. Tell us about HB 905.
This is the Foreign Interference Restriction and Enforcement Act, or the FIRE Act. Governor DeSantis signed it last Friday, May 8th, just 3 days ago. He chose a symbolic venue, the Bay of Pigs Museum in Miami, and emphasized the need to restrict contact with 7 countries of concern. Those are China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, Cuba, Syria, and what he called the Venezuelan regime of Nicolas Maduro.
What does the law actually do?
As Orlando Weekly reports, the bill was sponsored by Representative Jenna Persons-Mulica, and it has several provocative provisions. It declares any gestational surrogacy or pre-planned adoption agreement void and unenforceable if any party is a citizen or resident of those 7 countries. It also bars public officials from accepting gifts from those nations. And local governments can revoke business tax receipts for entities doing business with Cuba in violation of federal law.
The surrogacy provision really stands out. What's the justification for that?
Lawmakers like Representative Persons-Mulica cited national security and the prevention of, quote, birth tourism, end quote. But the Tallahassee Democrat notes there's no Florida-specific empirical data showing this is actually a widespread problem with these nations. Proponents leaned heavily on a high-profile case from California involving a Chinese couple and 20 surrogacy-born children. Critics say that's a thin foundation for such a sweeping ban.
Are civil rights groups pushing back yet?
The ACLU and others have expressed alarm, but no formal federal lawsuit has been filed against HB 905 as of today. That said, Florida Attorney General James Uthmeier has already opened a legal offensive against surrogacy in other cases. He's argued in the 4th District Court of Appeal that such contracts may constitute, quote, modern-day slavery, end quote, under the 13th Amendment. Many observers see that as a preview of how the state will defend the FIRE Act.
When does the law actually take effect?
July 1st, so about 7 weeks out. That gives advocacy groups a narrow window to mount a challenge before enforcement begins. And given the breadth of the provisions, from family law to local business licensing, the legal questions could pile up quickly.
Chloe, before we let you go, can you tie all 3 of these threads together for our listeners?
Sure. The through line is that the United States is on a dual war footing. There's a $200 billion conflict in the Persian Gulf, and a domestic immigration crisis playing out in the Florida swamps at Alligator Alcatraz. Add in Maduro awaiting trial in Brooklyn and Florida's FIRE Act about to take effect, And you have a political and legal landscape that's every bit as volatile as the environment surrounding that Everglades detention site.
A lot to keep an eye on in the weeks ahead. Chloe, thanks so much for breaking it down for us this morning.
My pleasure, Grace.
Here are some other headlines. In the world of academia, things are heating up, even as some funds cool off. On May 11, 2026, scientific communities expressed significant concern following the restoration of billions of dollars in federal research funding previously frozen by the administration. While these funds are finally being released to various agencies, researchers at institutions such as UC Berkeley and Columbia University argue the move is too little, too late to salvage long-term projects or rehire personnel lost during the hiatus. The atmosphere remains turbulent as the National Science Foundation recently froze 18 grants at Berkeley, citing concerns over foreign funding and compliance with anti-DEI executive orders. This ongoing friction has led to a class action lawsuit involving the National Institutes of Health and the Department of Energy. While U.S. District Judge Rita Lynn ruled that the categorical freezing of congressionally approved funds was likely out of bounds, Office of Management and Budget Director Russ Vought is pushing for forward funding strategies to consolidate spending. Critics and the Government Accountability Office fear this is just a tactic to bypass congressional mandates and prune the total number of new awards. This volatile environment threatens the viability of clinical trials and indigenous research projects for the remainder of the 2026 to 2027 fiscal cycle. Across the Atlantic, a French woman evacuated from the cruise ship MV Hondius has tested positive for the Andes strain of hantavirus. Health Minister Stephanie Rist confirmed the patient was one of 5 French nationals repatriated to Paris from the Canary Islands on Sunday. While most of these viruses usually stick to a rat race, spreading via rodent droppings, this Andes variant is noted for its rare ability to go viral between humans. Over 140 passengers have been scattered to more than 20 countries under strict biocontainment. The situation is breathtaking. With 3 deaths recorded in this month-long outbreak so far, the World Health Organization Director General Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus insists the general public risk remains low. One asymptomatic American passenger is currently being monitored at the University of Nebraska Medical Center, while all other former passengers must keep their eyes peeled during a 42-day monitoring period. In London, Prime Minister Keir Starmer is trying to cheer up his supporters after devastating local election results. He delivered a high-stakes address pledging to put Britain back at the heart of Europe, though he is still EU-turning when it comes to rejoining the single market or customs union. Starmer is proposing an alignment by default strategy and a youth mobility deal to address economic stagnation. However, he is facing some serious labor pains, as 36 lawmakers are calling for his resignation. If he cannot bridge the gap, backbencher Catherine West might trigger a formal leadership contest. We expect to see these European rules codified in a bill during the King's speech this Wednesday. Turning to the Philippines, Senator Ronald Bato de la Rosa is finding himself between a rock and a hard place. The National Police served him a subpoena regarding a revived investigation into extrajudicial killings during the previous administration's drug war. Interior Secretary Juanito Victor Remula Jr. confirmed the probe focuses on human rights abuses during the senator's time as police chief in Davao and later as the national head. While the International Criminal Court is already eyeing former President Rodrigo Duterte, this domestic move signals an intensified effort to address state-sponsored violence. De La Rosa is expected to appear at Camp Crame this Thursday, May 14th, provided he does not try to stonewall the investigation. Finally, passengers on a Turkish Airlines flight in Nepal had a landing that was a bit too lit. Flight 726 caught fire shortly after touching down at Kathmandu's International Airport at 6:34 a.m. Assistant spokesperson Ganindra Phul reported that the right main landing gear of the Airbus A330 ignited, forcing an evacuation of 288 people, including 277 passengers and 11 crew. 2 passengers suffered minor injuries, but everyone else escaped the heat. The incident grounded the country's only international runway for 98 minutes before operations resumed at 8:12 a.m., Investigators are now checking if the blaze was caused by a hard landing or just a tiring technical failure. That's all we have for now. Today's episode was made by Alexander King with Claude Opus 4.6, Gemini Pro 3.1, Gemini Flash 3, and Google Cloud Text-to-Speech. I hope you have a great day. I'll see you tomorrow, Alex.